About 15 years ago, I lived in Sulphur, Oklahoma. My playground, the Chickasaw National Recreation Area. I loved that park so much. I rode more miles on my bike there than anywhere else. I've walked nearly every trail and cycled every road. Every day, I would ride my mountain bike up and down the trails and would be home by nightfall most days. One night, however, I had rode out a bit further than usual. On my way back, I decided to ride the trail from an area known as Buffalo Springs, where they have live buffalo roam, and there is a large spring or fountain there for all to enjoy. As I was riding back, I knew the end of the trail was coming up, and I would have to cross a stone bridge across the creek, then up the road to my home. It was dark at this time, and all I had to use to see was the full moon. I was maybe a few hundred yards from it when I got a sharp pain in my left thigh. I stopped and looked around to see what had just hit me. Then I heard a noise that sounded like something hitting the ground hard in front of me. There was a rock about the size of a baseball rolling across the trail. Confused, I started to look up the side of this hill. Just as I turned my head to look, I almost fell off my bike when another rock came flying down and hit my front wheel. I finally caught movement and adjusted my line of sight to see someone very tall, dark, and covered in hair at the top of the hill throwing things at me and screaming. I yelled I had a cell phone and was going to call the police. I didn't actually have one, as I didn't own a cell phone yet, but this seemed to have annoyed him. He started charging down the hill at me. I, for obvious reasons, took off on my bike. Just as I crossed the bridge, I heard a huge splashing noise in the creek and saw a large rock that had been thrown. My route home was clear now, but I was frightened all the way there. The next morning, I went to the ranger station and told a ranger I knew well about what happened. He said, "So you were attacked by Bigfoot?" Snidely laughing. "I don't know what it was, but something was trying to hurt me out there." "Okay, Justin, if we have any more Bigfoot sightings, I'll let you know." I just said fine and left. A week later, I was riding in the daylight when the park ranger pulled up next to me and said for me to get in. I asked why. He said he needed to show me something. We headed to the police department in town. Before we got out of the car, he turned to me and said, "Justin, I need to give you a huge apology. I'll be honest that I didn't believe you when you told me that story of you being attacked. However, it has come to my attention that a couple was out in the same area last night and was attacked in the same way, saying they had seen a large hairy creature throwing rocks and sticks and screaming at them. They called the police and they came out with some of the other rangers, including myself. I immediately thought about what you had told me. When we arrived and started up the hill, sure enough, we were having rocks and things thrown at us. Guns drawn and yelling, 2 officers tackled a man to the ground. He was 6'5" tall, naked, covered in mud, and had long hair and a large beard. He had escaped from the Veterans Center across Veterans Lake. Apparently, he thought he was back in Vietnam, and he was trying to take out the enemy." The park ranger continued on, saying I was very lucky because he was trying to kill me. We went inside so I could give the police my statement as to what had happened. They had him sent to a more secure facility somewhere else. To this day, I still get the shivers when I hike that trail, and I always keep my eyes on the ridge top. I do feel bad for veterans suffering with PTSD and other such mental illnesses, but I hope to never see that man again. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fires with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from, and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course we knew this was dangerous, and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun, found beautiful rivers, discovered bridges no one went to. We fished and we hid from trains. At night, we camped in woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun, we did it multiple times, never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch, and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family during the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon, we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night and walk home. The day came. We started out early in the morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot, where we used to start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave a, "What the hell?" and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun, and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep in, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill, and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet. No movement could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews, and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point, it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on at early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and reminisced, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. Do you hear that? What the hell is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree, but it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights, as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the hell out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies. But again, it was like he was speaking in a different language, because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where their single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the hell out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walking out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around. But I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that ever happened to me out in the woods. Before I continue with the final story, if you've enjoyed this video so far, please leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to see future content from me, as well as help me in the algorithm. Thank you. I was camping in the middle of nowhere, in Washington, near Mount Rainier. Not an official campground, just way out in the forest, where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night, I woke up and heard something. Opened my tent, and there was a guy sitting by where my fire had been, right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular looking dude sitting there a couple of feet from my tent. No bag or pack or anything with him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent. His eyes got huge, like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day, I managed to take my mind off it. After writing it off as just some odd occurrence, and a guy that was probably high or something, and had somehow managed to set up a camp, coincidentally, not too far from mine. 2 days later, and 10 to 15 miles away, in totally random directions, and nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night, and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness, someone responded. "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no, I don't even think that's a real place. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away," and, kind of spooked, and not wanting to annoy a potentially crazy person, I did. After about 15 minutes of me being very freaked out, and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light that way again. And it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days, because there is no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot as vast as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but I didn't want to get lost in the wilderness, in the dark, so I stopped quickly after probably only 100 to 200 feet. This one couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places, specifically if he was following me. I decided the trip was over the very first thing in the morning, and hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent. But by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but slowly sounded more like a human making animal calls. I didn't actually see the guy again, but it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I almost cried when I finally got back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this day, it's probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was, or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation. But I really can't articulate just how terrifying those few days were.